Okay, so everybody's going on about the budget, but how does it actually affect you if you move to London or your local big city and you're just trying to stay afloat as a self-employed freelancer professional? Well, fear not. In this video, I'm going to explain exactly how the budget affects people like you when you probably don't have a car and things like that, and actually why it's probably not all so bad, at least on the surface. Let's get right to it. So the first thing to point out is that the income tax bands have remained unchanged, which actually means that we've got a sense of fiscal drag. So a lot of people will think, oh, okay, their income tax, national insurance is not going up. But actually, when you factor in inflation, the cost of things going up, many people are being dragged into higher tax brackets. Many people are going into that 40% tax bracket in particular, and are really feeling the effects of having so much of their take-home pay snapped up, particularly if you've got a student loan repayment. When you factor in national insurance is my big pet peeve. Tax, which I think disproportionately affects the younger generations. So that's something that the government has kind of managed to get away with, because they've said that they're not going to raise taxes, but actually fiscal drag allows them to kind of keep that going. They've said that they will remove it from 2028, so that's somewhat promising. There was already a precedent from the previous government that it was going to stay, where these tax bands will remain unchanged. So the tax-free allowance will stay at that base rate. Okay, capital gains tax on profits from selling shares has increased from 10 to 18%, with the higher rate rising from 20 to 24%. Now, I've mentioned before that if you are able to save and you're thinking, oh, I'm not able to buy, one of the things that you can do in the UK is put money into a stocks and shares ISA, so that any gains are protected. You can put up to £20,000 a year, so you should totally be using that. You can kind of build towards a pension, hashtag not a financial advisor, but that's totally something that you can do there. Right, let's move on. Inheritance tax threshold freeze extended by further 2 years to 2030, with unspent pension pots also subject to the tax from 2027. So inheritance tax is very much a contentious issue, but I have to say I do agree with the idea that pension pots should be taxed on inheritance, because actually, when you think about the reason why they weren't, it was often because when you would have a husband probably supporting his spouse, and that was why it would be passed on. But actually, we're living in a very different world now. Both partners are out working, so it's a two-income household in marriages. So I think that totally makes sense that they should be taxed like everything else, if everything else is going to be taxed inheritance wise. I do take issue with the tax on properties and the kind of debts that people are left with, because if you don't have access to social housing and things like that, it means the chances that some families and households will get is really reliant upon inheritance. And I know there's this thing about only 4% of estates pay inheritance tax, but I really think that's going to deeply rise, and I think there's a lot of contention with that figure as well, particularly with the rates of property and so forth. Right, okay, let's move on now. This next one is a really big one. Companies will now have to pay national insurance at 15% of salaries, whereas before it was 13.8%. This is a big one. Now, this could actually benefit self-employed freelancers, because if you're going out contracting, some employers might actually downsize their kind of employment pool and think, you know what, we're going to take a contractor on for a few days. So if you're somebody that watches this channel and enjoys a kind of a portfolio sense of work, where you can do some days on one project and move to another and build up a business and want to charge a higher rate, this could really benefit you. And another thing to bear in mind is that, and I read a really interesting article about this, is that often employers can save about 50% when they hire a contractor. So you could argue that your fee should be double when you take into account things like pension contributions, any liable sick pay, but also the employer's national insurance that they pay on your wage. So that's already 15%, and the whole raft of other benefits and so forth that they pay to retain staff, the cost of hiring and so forth, the ongoing training. That's another thing. As self-employed people, we pay often for our own training. So that might help people trying to get higher paid contractor work. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in that space. Now, this is something I really wanted to mention here, is that there's a £2 cap on bus fares outside of London, and that's going to rise to £3. Now, why is it important that I mention that here? It's because I really want to give you the perspective that if you're in a major city like London, and Greater Manchester is one, that you have really subsidised transport network. You're not most people having to pay for a car if you live in the city, and the cost of the insurances, the MOT, the petrol and all of that. The bus fare, I think it's something like £1.75. It's really economical, and that £3 rise that they've got outside of London is steep. I mean, it's a 50% increase. I thought maybe £2.50 would have been more reasonable. I know they've got to find the money from somewhere, but that's really going to be something that's going to frustrate a lot of people. I think it's good that they introduced this single bus fare, because I remember years ago it used to get really ridiculous. Sometimes the bus fare could easily be like £3-4 back in my hometown, but that's still quite a steep increase. So, and I mentioned that to give you that perspective that, okay, when you're in the city, this is something that you get as really good value, despite the cost of living and the cost of your rent being really high. That's something that actually I'm really grateful for. Right, okay, so let's move on. HS2 speed rail line, there's commitment to fund tunnelling work there. The Transpennine rail upgrade between York and Manchester. I'm all for, when I work outside of London and I get booked for places around the country in my corporate work, I really am all for making sure that there's better transport links. There's some train lines that I get on, and often they're so unreliable, particularly if I've got a gig in the evening. I'm going to host one of my quiz nights. I come back and it's just sort of like, I don't even know if I'm going to be able to make it on time, because I plan to get this train, and even if I gave a 15-minute leeway and then it's just sort of been cancelled, you have to rush on to the next one. The trains really are unreliable, particularly the line that runs up to Manchester. So I really sympathise with that. I think there just needs to be a lot better transportation in the north. Right, okay, let's move on. Drinking and smoking. There's a tax on now vaping, and the tobacco tax is being increased. I mean, I'm not a smoker, but I do sympathise with smokers. They pay a lot into the system. They're actually going to increase the sugar tax and extend that to milk-based beverages. Now, I mention this because I'm all for this kind of notion of really creating an environment where we can cut down on our sugar, because I really think sugar, I mean, it's something that I've been addicted to. I've got a sweet tooth, but I'm conscious, because I think, well, what does actually that go into? You know, are they going to put more money into the health service and so forth? Because it is a problem, and milk-based drinks do have high sugar. I appreciate that there's a cut on the on the drafts and on alcohol. Now, I know that's controversial, but I have to say, as somebody that often works in bars, hosting my quiz nights, I really see how the bars are struggling. They're often just trying to break even on nights, and they're just really they're spending money on people like me to come in and build an atmosphere and create events, and they're employing people, and they're paying really high business rates. So, and we want our bars to thrive in London and create that atmosphere. We need them in the city, so or in your local city, for events and as a social space, particularly in the evenings when the kind of coffee shops and places like that close. Right, government spending on public services, they are going to spend quite a lot on defence, and you think, well, could that be better spent elsewhere? But then we're in quite an uncertain world with the war in Ukraine and so forth, and all the tension rising. The day-to-day spending on the NHS and England to rise by 4.7% in real terms this year. I think that that's really important. I mean, the NHS, they say, is on its knees. Older generations have benefited from the NHS. It's something we should have. I know we're an aging society. I think it's really important that we can have access to, to health services and be healthy. So yeah, I'm all for that. 1.3 billion pounds extra funding next year for local councils, and they can keep the cash from right to buy sales next month. I mean, yeah, that's great because it's depleted the housing stock. Social housing providers to be allowed to increase rents above inflation under multi-year settlement. Now, controversially, I'm going to say I agree with that, because particularly in London and high cost of living cities, I was never eligible to have social housing. I hardly know anybody that's kind of coming from outside London, and it was really getting ridiculous, sort of the gap that was widening between those on the private sector, like I was. As I say, I will be explaining my current living situation in a new video. But also the gap between the rents and with those that are in social housing, it's a real problem, and we need to just really look at that. And discounts for social housing tenants buying their property under the right to buy scheme to be reduced. I agree with that, because I think if you get a social rent, you've kind of hit a jackpot in a way. A great opportunity of really subsidised living. You can use that to instead just build up your pension, because there's always two things. You're always going to need somewhere to live, and then money to live off. So you can always just build that up, and there are just so many people vying for these homes now, and not everybody is eligible to queue. The affordable homes budget, which runs until 2026, has been boosted by £500 million. I'm not going to make any judgment on that. We do need more affordable homes, but I think the devil will be in the detail. It depends on the type of homes being built. I want more intermediate rent homes in the city, so that people that move into the city have access to high value housing that can really rival that on the private market, and not make everybody sort of ransom to private rents. So I think that that's really important, and can have the opportunity to build up their freelancer career discipline in the city. Because if it's just all social housing that a lot of people aren't eligible for, I take issue with that, because it disenfranchises those that are on the private market that would like to have access to affordable housing. And then obviously if it's shared ownership with high service charges, again, as I say, devil's in the detail. Okay, UK growth, inflation and debt. Inflation is predicted to average 2.5% this year, 2.6% next year, before falling to 2.3%. So we're really going to have to wait and see if this is going to cause an inflationary effect with all these tax increases, because this is going to raise a lot of money for the government, and hopefully they will spend this wisely. I mean, the NHS is getting a massive increase, and hopefully they'll really be able to make it efficient. NHS does need both more funding, but also it needs an overhaul in the system so that it can be even more efficient. Another thing that I want to point out here, this is a steep one. The stamp duty surcharge will go up from 3% to 5%. That's a big one. That's on second home purchases. I somewhat sympathise with the need to do that, because I think so many people are struggling to find a home. There are a lot of empty homes. But then there's also this big one that for first time buyers, the threshold will drop from 425 to 300,000, and often in London it's difficult for a lot of people for a first home. So that's a big that affects a lot of people, and particularly people trying to get their foot in. It will be interesting to see what the effects of that are on private rent. So if people struggle to sell their homes, or will it mean that will it help stabilize prices and help people to be able to get onto the property ladder that otherwise thought they wouldn't have, because it will give them more time to play catch up with a kind of stagnant property market. So we'll see in that case, because a lot of the prices in London in particular are kind of leveling. They're not kind of going up so much. So there is a kind of sense of catch up. So many homes are on the market now, but we'll see. I hope people won't have their rents increased in the city. That's really important, I think, because it's eating up a lot of people's capacity to be able to sort of pursue whatever it is that they move to the city for and the life that they want to build. So there you have it. That's my deep dive into the budget. What do you think? Are there things that are missing in it for you? Do you think it goes far enough? Do you think it goes too far? Is there something that you're particularly like, that is not okay, I'm not happy with that? Or you kind of like, oh, okay, it's not easy, but I accept things the way they are. What's your opinion on this all? And as somebody that's self-employed living in the city, how do you think that this is going to affect you? Thanks very much for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.